The letter arrived without warning, and it changed everything before Margaret Ashby had even finished reading the first line. She stood in the narrow hallway of her rented rooms above the dress shop, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, and read the words again to make certain she had not misunderstood them. A house, deeded fully in her name, purchased by the Duke of Ashbourne. She had met the man exactly twice, once at a charity dinner where she had been fitting gowns for the hostess and had been introduced only as an afterthought, and once again outside a bookshop on Bond Street, where he had held the door for her and said nothing more than good afternoon. Twice. That was the entire history between them, and now his solicitor's letter sat in her hand, informing her that a townhouse on Marlow Street, fully furnished, staffed, and paid for in full, awaited her arrival whenever she wished to take possession. Margaret set the letter down on the small table by the window and pressed her palms flat against the wood, as though she needed something solid beneath her hands to keep the room from tilting. She was a seamstress. She earned her own bread, paid her own rent, and answered to no one for the roof over her head. She had built that independence stitch by stitch, through long nights and aching fingers, and she was not about to let a stranger with a title undo it with the stroke of a pen. She folded the letter twice, tucked it into her sleeve, and reached for her shawl. The Ashbourne townhouse in Grosvenor Square was the kind of building that made a person feel small before they even reached the door. Margaret climbed the front steps without allowing herself to hesitate, and she rapped the brass knocker 3 times, hard enough that her knuckles ached afterward. A footman answered, startled by the sight of an unaccompanied woman demanding entry, and it took the full weight of her composure and the letter pulled from her sleeve to convince him to fetch his master. She waited in a receiving room with pale blue walls and a fire that had been lit against the autumn chill, and she did not sit down. She stood in the center of the carpet with her arms folded, rehearsing what she meant to say, and when the door finally opened, every rehearsed word left her at once. Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne was taller than she remembered, and there was something careful in the way he moved, as though he had trained himself not to make sudden gestures. His eyes went to the letter still clutched in her hand before they went to her face. "You cannot simply buy a woman a house," Margaret said, before he had crossed halfway into the room. "It is not a kindness. It is an insult dressed up as a gift." He stopped where he stood. "I did not intend it as either." "Then what did you intend it as, Your Grace? Because from where I stand, a man does not hand a house to a woman he has spoken to twice unless he wants something from her, or unless he is trying to bury something he does not wish to speak of." Something shifted behind his eyes at that, quick and gone before she could name it, but she had seen enough hems and seams in her years of work to know when fabric had been cut to hide a flaw. There was a flaw here, she was certain of it. "It is not for the reasons you imagine," he said finally, his voice low and even. "The house has stood empty for some time. It seemed a waste to let it remain so." Margaret laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "There are 100 ways to fill an empty house, Your Grace. Renting it, selling it, housing a cousin, a widowed aunt, a retired steward. You did not choose any of those. You chose me, a woman with no claim on you whatsoever. Explain that, and I will consider your gift. Refuse to explain it, and I will refuse the house." He was silent long enough that she thought he might simply let her leave without answering. Then he said, "You remind me of someone." The words landed strangely, quieter than anything else he had said, and something about the way he said them made the hair rise on the back of Margaret's neck. "Who?" "That is not a conversation I am prepared to have today," he said, and the shutters came down over his face again, that same careful control settling back into place like a door closing. Margaret studied him a long moment. She had spent years learning to read people through small details, the same way she read fabric, watching for the places where the seams pulled too tight, or the fit did not quite sit right on the shoulders. Everything about Nathaniel Ashbourne in that moment told her he was not lying to her, not exactly, but he was withholding something enormous, something that lived just beneath the surface of every careful word he chose. "I will not move into a house I do not understand," she said. "I will not live inside another woman's shadow, Your Grace, and make no mistake, that is exactly what this is. You may keep your townhouse and your secrets together, and I will keep my 2 rooms above the dress shop, where at least I know every corner of what I own." She turned toward the door, and behind her she heard him take a single step forward, as though to stop her, and then stop himself. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name aloud. "Wait." She turned back, her hand already on the doorframe. "Take the key," he said, "not to live there, only to see it. Walk through the rooms once. If, after that, you still wish to refuse it, I will not trouble you again." She hesitated, and hated herself a little for hesitating, because curiosity had always been her weakness, the itch she could never quite ignore. "Very well," she said. "Once, and then you owe me an explanation, whether you are prepared to give it or not." He crossed the room and pressed a small brass key into her palm, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and she felt the contact more than she wanted to admit. There was something in his eyes as he looked at her then, something that was not quite grief and not quite guilt, but sat somewhere uncomfortably close to both. "The house is not what it seems," he said quietly. "Neither am I. I would rather you learn both slowly than not at all." Margaret closed her fingers around the key. "That is the first honest thing you have said to me, Your Grace." She left Grosvenor Square with the letter still in her sleeve, and the key now warm in her palm, and she did not look back at the house, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire way down the front steps. The carriage he offered she refused, choosing instead to walk, because she needed the cold air and the noise of the street to think clearly, away from the quiet weight of his study and the strange ache that had settled behind her ribs. By the time she reached Marlow Street, the light was fading into a soft gray dusk, and the townhouse stood before her exactly as the letter had described it. Tall and handsome, with dark green shutters and a brass door knocker shaped like a lion's head. It did not look like a house that held any secret at all. It looked, if anything, like a house that had been waiting. Margaret climbed the steps slowly and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, practiced ease that told her it had been recently oiled, recently prepared, as though someone had been expecting her to come exactly like this, alone, in the fading light, with more questions than answers. The door swung open onto a hallway lit by a single lamp already burning, though no one should have known to expect her. The air inside smelled faintly of beeswax polish and something else beneath it, something floral and old, like a memory of perfume that had never quite faded from the walls. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, and the sound of it closing echoed through rooms that felt, despite their silence, very far from empty. She moved slowly through the rooms on the ground floor first, unwilling to admit even to herself how carefully she was searching for something out of place. The parlor held furniture too fine for an empty house left to gather dust. Chairs upholstered in pale gold silk, a writing desk polished to a shine, a bowl of dried lavender set on the mantel as though someone had arranged it that very morning, and simply stepped out. There was no film of neglect anywhere, no sheets draped over the furniture the way a house closed up for years ought to have. Everything sat ready, waiting, as though the last person to leave these rooms had only just gone out for air. In the dining room she found a cabinet of fine china, each piece painted with a border of small white roses, and beside it a portrait frame hung on the wall, empty, the canvas removed but the hook and the faint outline of dust around its edges still showing exactly where it had once been. She stood before that bare frame longer than she meant to, wondering what face had been cut away from this house before she arrived, and why someone had taken the trouble to remove a painting rather than simply leave the room as it was. She climbed the staircase next, her hand trailing along a banister so smooth it must have been polished within the week, and on the landing she found more rooms, each one furnished with the same quiet, expensive care. A bedroom done in soft cream and rose, a dressing room with an looking-glass tall enough to show a woman head to foot, a small sitting room with a chair pulled close to the window, angled as though someone had liked to sit there and watch the street below. None of it felt abandoned. All of it felt paused, as though the house had simply been holding its breath, waiting for someone to walk back through the door. It was only when she returned to the ground floor, meaning to leave before the dark set in fully, that she noticed the narrow hallway she had passed without a second glance on her way in. It ran alongside the staircase, tucked behind a half wall, easy to miss unless a person was looking for exactly what she was now looking for. A place a house might keep something it did not want found. At the end of the hallway, past the receiving rooms and the staircase curling upward into shadow, she saw it. A single door, narrower than the others, painted the same dark green as the shutters outside, with a small brass lock set into its frame. Unlike every other door in the house, this one had no handle at all, only the lock, and no key on Margaret's ring that seemed to fit it. She pressed her palm flat against the wood the way she had pressed it against the table in her own rented rooms that morning, as though she might feel through the grain of it some trace of what waited on the other side. The wood was cool and gave nothing away. She crouched slightly and studied the lock itself, small and old-fashioned. The kind of lock that belonged to a house built generations ago rather than one recently purchased and freshly staffed. It did not match the newer brass fittings on every other door she had passed. It looked as though it had been there far longer than the rest of the house around it, untouched, deliberately left exactly as it was. She thought of the empty frame in the dining room, and the chair pulled close to the window as though someone had only just risen from it, and the lavender in the bowl that had not yet begun to dry, brittle and gray. Someone had lived in this house, recently and completely, and someone had gone to great trouble afterward to make certain that every trace of that life remained sealed behind this one door. Margaret stood in the darkening hallway with the key to every other room in the house still warm in her hand, and she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, that the Duke of Ashbourne had not given her a house at all. He had given her a question, wrapped in silk and polished brass, and he fully expected her to spend every waking hour trying to answer it. She would not rest until she found a way to open that door. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the dress shop with the brass key resting on the table beside her, and every time she closed her eyes she saw that green door again, the lock too old for the rest of the house, the empty frame on the dining room wall, the lavender bowl that had not yet begun to dry. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not move into the house, not yet, not until she understood what it held. But she would not stay away from it either. She sent word to the dress shop that she required a few days away from her usual work, packed a single trunk with what she needed for a short stay, and returned to Marlow Street before noon. The staff had clearly been told to expect her, because the door opened before she had even reached the top step, and a woman introduced herself as the housekeeper, a steady, plain-spoken woman named Hannah Doyle, who showed Margaret through the house with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to instructions rather than explanations. Margaret waited until the tour had circled back near the narrow hallway behind the staircase before she asked the question directly. That door, the green one, what is kept behind it? Hannah's expression did not change, but something in her posture stiffened, the way fabric pulls tight when a seam has been stitched too close to the edge. I could not say, miss. It has always been locked, before my time here and after it. Who has the key? I do not know that either, miss. His Grace has never given instructions to open it, and I have never asked. Margaret studied her a moment, certain there was more behind the woman's careful, practiced tone, but she did not press further. She had learned enough in her years of dealing with difficult customers to know that pushing too hard too soon closed doors rather than opened them, and Hannah Doyle's loyalty, whatever its cause, was clearly not going to bend on the first afternoon. Instead, Margaret spent the following days doing what she did best. She watched. She noticed the way the younger housemaid, a girl no older than 17 named Clara, went pale and quiet whenever she passed near the green door with her dusting cloths, always finding some reason to clean the opposite end of the hall first. She noticed that the gardener, an old man who had clearly worked the grounds for years, referred once to the mistress without catching himself, then flushed and changed the subject entirely when Margaret asked who he meant. She noticed, too, that no one used the name Eleanor, not once, not even in passing, and yet the careful way the entire staff avoided any name at all told her that a name existed, waiting just beneath the surface of every conversation, the way the empty portrait frame waited on the dining room wall. On the second afternoon, restless and unwilling to sit idle while questions piled up unanswered, Margaret decided to explore the house on her own terms, without Hannah Doyle trailing beside her offering careful, empty answers. She waited until the housekeeper had gone down to the kitchens to oversee the ordering of supplies, and then she moved quietly through the upper floor, opening doors she had only glanced into during the formal tour. In the dressing room with the tall looking-glass, she found a wardrobe still filled with gowns, each one wrapped in linen to protect the fabric from dust, and when she lifted the corner of one wrapping she saw a deep blue silk, cut in a style that had been fashionable perhaps 2 or 3 years before. The stitching along the hem was fine, careful work, the kind Margaret herself would have been proud to produce, and she found herself wondering, with an ache she had not expected, whether the woman who wore it had loved fine clothes the way Margaret loved making them. She closed the wardrobe gently and moved on, and in a small writing room at the end of the corridor she found a shelf of books, several with a delicate, looping signature inside the cover, though the given name had been carefully cut away with a small blade, leaving only the surname, faint and half destroyed. She ran her thumb over the damaged page, feeling the rough edge where the paper had been sliced rather than torn, and understood that someone had gone through this house with great deliberate care, removing every trace of a first name while leaving everything else intact, as though the person doing it could not bear complete erasure but could not bear the sound of the name either. It was in that small writing room that Clara found her, arms full of fresh linens for the hall closet, and the girl startled so badly at the sight of Margaret standing among the books that she nearly dropped the entire stack. "Forgive me, miss. I did not know anyone was up here." Margaret set the damaged book gently back on the shelf. "I am only looking, Clara. You need not apologize. May I ask you something, and you need not answer if you would rather not?" Clara's eyes went, almost involuntarily, toward the door and then back to Margaret, and she gave a small, uncertain nod. "Did you know her? The woman who lived here before?" "I came into service after, miss," Clara said quietly, shifting the linens in her arms. "But the older staff speak of her sometimes, when they think no one is listening. They say the house was full of music before. She played the pianoforte in the evenings, and sometimes His Grace would come simply to sit and listen, before he was Duke, when his brother still held the title." Margaret felt something settle into place at that detail. Small but significant, a piece of the picture shifting into clearer focus. His brother. Clara's face changed at once, as though she understood she had said more than she meant to, and she dropped a quick, flustered curtsy. "I really must get these linens put away, miss. Please do not mention that I said anything." She hurried off before Margaret could ask another question, and Margaret stood alone in the small writing room for a long while afterward, turning the new information over in her mind. A brother. A title that had passed to Nathaniel rather than originating with him. A woman who played music in a house that now sat silent, its finest room locked away behind a door with no handle. She thought of the empty portrait frame in the dining room again, and wondered, with a slow, uneasy feeling gathering in her chest, whether the painting removed from that wall had shown the woman alone, or whether it had shown her beside someone else entirely, someone whose face the household had also been instructed never to mention. That night Margaret barely touched her supper, her mind circling the same handful of facts without ever quite arranging them into a shape she could trust. A woman who furnished this house with her own hands, a brother who had once held the title before Nathaniel, a locked door guarded by silence on every side. She did not yet know how the pieces fit together, only that they did, somewhere beneath the careful surface Nathaniel presented to the world, and that whatever truth waited there was heavier than a simple story of grief for a woman he had once loved and lost. On the third evening, Margaret sat at the small writing desk in the parlor and composed a letter to the Duke, brief and direct. She informed him that she remained at the house, that she had not unpacked a single trunk beyond what she needed for the days she intended to stay, and that she would not consider the house her own, nor consider any future conversation between them, until the green door had been opened and its contents explained. The reply came the following morning, not by letter but in person. Nathaniel arrived at Marlow Street just after breakfast, dressed plainly for a man of his rank, and Margaret received him in the parlor with the fire lit and her arms folded in the same posture she had worn the day she first confronted him in Grosvenor Square. "You are testing my patience, Your Grace, or I am testing yours. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps both," he said, and there was something almost like humor in it, though it did not reach his eyes. "I have unpacked nothing," she said. "I sleep in a room that is not mine, in a house that is not mine, surrounded by furniture too fine and too fresh to belong to an empty building, and every servant beneath this roof flinches at a door they refuse to name. I did not agree to live inside a mystery, Your Grace. I agreed to walk through it once and then hear your explanation." Nathaniel crossed to the window and stood with his back half turned to her, looking out at the quiet street below, and Margaret recognized the posture immediately, because it was the same stillness he had worn in his own study days before, the stillness of a man choosing his words as carefully as a soldier choosing his ground. "The house belonged to someone I intended to marry," he said finally. "She furnished it herself, chose every piece in every room, down to the china in the cabinet and the flowers on the mantel. She never had the chance to live in it." Margaret's arms slowly unfolded. "What happened to her?" "That is not a simple answer, and I am not yet prepared to give the whole of it," he said, turning back to face her. "But I will tell you this much. The room behind the green door was hers alone, kept exactly as she left it, and I have not opened it since the day I gave the order to lock it." "Why give me this house at all, then?" Margaret asked, her voice quieter now, some of the fight gone out of it and replaced with something closer to genuine confusion. "If it belonged so completely to her, why place another woman inside it?" "Because I could not bear to sell it, and I could not bear to live in it myself, and because when I saw you outside that bookshop, something in me that has been closed for 2 years opened without my permission," he said, and the honesty in his voice startled her more than anything he had said before. "I told myself I was giving you a house. I think, in truth, I was giving myself a reason to see you again without having to explain why." The fire popped softly in the grate, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath the argument she had prepared, felt her carefully guarded suspicion tangling with something warmer and far more dangerous, an understanding that the man standing across the room from her was not hiding a scandal so much as carrying a grief he did not know how to set down. "That does not answer why the door remains locked," she said finally. holding on to the one thread of her original demand she still had strength to hold. If you cared for her, why seal her away instead of remembering her properly? Because I have not yet forgiven myself enough to walk through that door and see her handwriting on the desk, or her shawl still hung across the chair, he said, and his voice caught, just slightly, on the last words. I am not ready. I do not know when I will be. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and something in her hardened resolve began, unwillingly, to soften. Then we will not open it today, she said. But you will tell me the rest, Your Grace, all of it, not in pieces measured out to manage my curiosity, but the whole truth, when you are able to give it. Until then, I will stay in this house, in the rooms she never touched, and I will not pretend I am not living beside her memory every hour I remain here. Nathaniel nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders eased, as though her demand, rather than pushing him further away, had given him permission to stop pretending the weight did not exist. That evening, after he had gone, Margaret walked once more to the narrow hallway behind the staircase and stood before the green door in the lamplight. She did not try the lock. She only rested her hand flat against the wood, the way she had the very first day, and this time she spoke quietly into the silence of the house. I do not know your name yet, she said. But I promise you, whoever you were, I will not let him keep you locked away forever, and I will not let you become a ghost he uses to keep the rest of us at a careful distance either. Behind her, unseen, Hannah Doyle paused at the top of the stairs, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth, and then continued on her way without a word. Margaret noticed the pause, though she said nothing of it. She had grown skilled, over her days in that house, at noticing what people did not say as much as what they did, and the housekeeper's stillness told her more than any careful answer could have. Whatever secret this house guarded, it did not belong to Nathaniel alone. It had settled into every corner of the household, into the way Clara avoided the hallway and the gardener caught himself mid-sentence, into the careful blankness Hannah wore like a second uniform. She climbed the stairs slowly afterward, past the small writing room with its damaged book, past the dressing room with its wrapped blue silk, and into the bedroom that had become, however reluctantly, her own for the time being. She sat by the window with the lamp turned low and thought of the brother Clara had mentioned, the one who had held the title before Nathaniel, and wondered where he was now, whether he still lived, whether his absence from every conversation in this house was accidental, or as carefully arranged as the missing first name cut from the front of every book. She thought too of the way Nathaniel's voice had caught when he spoke of forgiveness, the particular weight in the words "I have not yet forgiven myself," which suggested something far more complicated than simple mourning. Grief did not usually require forgiveness, guilt did. Margaret did not know, that night, how close she stood to the truth, only that she had gathered enough loose threads to sense the shape of a larger pattern waiting beneath them, the way a skilled seamstress could feel the structure of a garment long before the final stitches were sewn. She resolved, before she finally allowed herself to sleep, that she would learn the brother's name before she learned anything else, and that once she had it, the rest of the pattern would begin to reveal itself whether Nathaniel Ashbourne was ready to show it to her or not. The gossip reached Margaret before she had even finished her tea. She had gone, against her better judgment, to a small gathering hosted by one of her regular clients, a merchant's wife who liked to display the gowns Margaret had made for her while pretending the conversation had drifted there by accident, and it was in that crowded, overheated parlor that she first heard her own name spoken by strangers. A woman near the window, fan moving in quick, agitated strokes, was saying to her companion that the Duke of Ashbourne had installed a seamstress in a Marlow Street townhouse, and that no one could say why, and that it was surely only a matter of time before the truth came out, whatever shape that truth might take. Her companion murmured something about how quickly some women rose in the world when a title took an interest, and the first woman laughed behind her fan, a sharp, knowing sound that made Margaret's face burn even from across the room. She left earlier than she had planned, her chin high and her steps even, refusing to give either woman the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words had landed. But the walk back to Marlow Street felt longer than usual, every passing carriage seeming to slow just slightly as it passed her, every face on the street seeming to linger a moment too long before looking away. By the following week, the whispers had grown teeth. A note arrived from one of her longtime clients, politely worded but unmistakable in its meaning, informing Margaret that her services would no longer be required, as the family did not wish to be associated, even at a distance, with matters currently circulating through society. 2 more notes followed within days, each one dressed in the same careful, regretful language, each one costing Margaret income she could not easily afford to lose. Margaret sat that evening with her account book open before her, tallying what income she had already lost and what she stood to lose if even one more client wrote to sever the arrangement, and the figures were not kind. She had spent years building a reputation careful enough to survive on its own merit, without connections, without patronage, without anything but the quality of her work and the discretion of her manner. And she watched now as a single unearned rumor threatened to undo in a fortnight what had taken her the better part of a decade to construct. She thought, briefly and bitterly, of simply returning the key, of walking away from the house on Marlow Street, and the man who had given it to her, and the whole tangled mystery it contained, and letting the gossip die the slow, natural death that gossip eventually died once it had nothing fresh to feed on. But even as she turned the thought over, she knew she would not do it. She had never in her life walked away from a puzzle half solved, and she was not about to start now, not when every instinct she possessed told her that the answer waiting behind that green door mattered more than a handful of lost commissions, and not when some stubborn, unguarded part of her had already begun to care what happened to the careful, guarded man who kept giving her the truth in pieces small enough not to break either of them. She said nothing of this to Nathaniel when he called that week, though she suspected from the careful way he studied her face that he already knew. Instead, she asked him directly what he intended to do about a situation his own gift had created, and he told her, with a grim, tired honesty that surprised her, that he had considered making their arrangement public in the most respectable terms possible, an announcement of his patronage, a formal explanation that would satisfy society's appetite for scandal, with something dull enough to bore them into silence. But he had hesitated, he admitted, because doing so would tie her name publicly to his before either of them understood what stood between them, and he did not want her bound to him by gossip rather than by choice. Margaret appreciated the honesty even as it left her without a clear solution, and it was in the middle of this uncertainty, 3 days later, that fate handed her exactly the piece of the puzzle she had been searching for, though not in any way she could have predicted. She had gone to the milliner's shop 2 streets from Marlow Street to select ribbon for a gown she was finishing for one of the few clients who had not yet abandoned her, and it was there, standing at the counter comparing 2 shades of green silk, that an older woman approached her directly, without introduction, her eyes sharp and assessing beneath the brim of an elegant, old-fashioned bonnet. The woman wore a bonnet trimmed in dark violet ribbon, plainly expensive but chosen without vanity, and her posture carried the particular straightness of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at and had long ago stopped caring what conclusions strangers drew. She studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking, the way a portrait painter might study a subject before the first brushstroke, weighing something Margaret could not quite name. "You are the young woman living in the Ashbourne house on Marlow Street," the woman said. It was not a question. Margaret set down the ribbon she had been holding. "I am, though I do not believe we have met." "Constance Ashbourne," the woman said. "Nathaniel's aunt, on his father's side, and the only member of that family still willing to speak his name in public without flinching. I have wanted to meet you since the gossip began, if only to see for myself what sort of woman had finally cracked that boy's armor." Margaret studied her carefully, uncertain whether the woman intended kindness or something sharper, but there was a directness in Constance's manner that Margaret found, despite herself, immediately trustworthy, the same directness she valued in her own dealings with difficult clients. "You seem to know a great deal about a situation I understand very little of myself," Margaret said. "I have been living inside a house full of silence for weeks now, Lady Ashbourne, and no one, including your nephew, seems willing to fill it with anything more than fragments." Constance's expression shifted, something softening behind the sharpness. "Walk with me," she said. "I find shop counters poor places for honest conversation, and I suspect you have earned rather more honesty than you have received." They walked together along the quieter side streets, away from the busier avenues where familiar faces might overhear, and Constance spoke slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who had held a secret so long that releasing even a small piece of it felt like breaking something. "Nathaniel was not always meant to hold the title," she began. "His elder brother Edmund was to inherit everything, the dukedom, the estates, all of it, and Nathaniel was content to live in his shadow, as younger sons often are. Edmund was engaged to be married to a young woman named Eleanor Vance, a gifted, spirited creature who filled every room she entered with more warmth than the rest of that cold family ever managed on its own. She furnished the Marlow Street house herself, in anticipation of her marriage, choosing every piece with such care that Edmund used to tease her about it, saying she was decorating a house before she had even secured the husband to live in it with her. Margaret felt her chest tighten, the pieces she had gathered over the past weeks beginning, at last, to align. What happened to her? "There was an accident," Constance said, her voice growing quieter, more careful. A carriage accident, on the road returning from a country estate one winter evening. Edmund was driving. The weather had turned poor, the roads were icy, and the carriage overturned. Eleanor did not survive the night. Edmund survived the accident itself, but not, in any way that mattered afterward, the guilt of it. He took his own life within the year, and the title passed to Nathaniel, along with every room in that house Eleanor had never lived to occupy, and every unspoken accusation that Nathaniel has carried on his brother's behalf ever since, though he was not the one driving that carriage, and he was not the one who failed her. Margaret walked in silence for several steps, absorbing the weight of it, understanding at last why the house had been sealed rather than sold, why a locked door with no handle had seemed, to a grieving man, the only bearable way to hold two deaths inside four walls without collapsing beneath them. Margaret thought of the wardrobe full of wrapped gowns, the deep blue silk she had lifted so carefully from its linen covering, and understood now why the stitching had seemed so fresh, so recently finished, a gown made for a wedding that never arrived. She thought of the book with its cutaway name, the careful, deliberate slice of a blade through paper, and wondered whether it had been Nathaniel's hand that did it, unable to bear the sight of Eleanor's full name written out in her own hand, or whether it had been someone else in that grieving household, a mother perhaps, or a servant told to erase what could not otherwise be endured. Was there no family of her own, she asked, no one to have kept some part of her, rather than leaving every trace of her locked inside a house she never lived in? A sister. In the north, Constance said. They write, I believe, though rarely, and the sister has never once set foot in the Marlow Street house. Grief takes different shapes in different people, and some prefer distance to reminders. Eleanor's family blamed Edmund bitterly for the accident, whatever the truth of the icy road and the poor light that evening, and that blame did not soften when Edmund took his own life. If anything, it hardened into something colder, a silence that swallowed whatever affection might once have existed between the two families before the carriage overturned. Why has no one told me this before? She asked finally. Why has Nathaniel let me search for scraps when the whole truth might have spared us both so much difficulty? Because guilt makes cowards of even good men, Constance said. Nathaniel has spent 2 years believing that grief belongs only to those closest to the tragedy, and that speaking of it plainly would somehow diminish what his brother and Eleanor suffered. He locked that door not to hide her, but because he did not trust himself to walk through it without breaking entirely. And a man who has spent his whole life being the steady one does not break easily, even when breaking is exactly what he needs. They walked on a little further, and Constance stopped at last at a corner where their paths would separate, and she took Margaret's hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. I tell you this not to excuse him, but so that you understand what you are standing in the middle of, she said. He gave you that house because some part of him, buried beneath all that careful control, wanted to fill it with life again instead of grief, and he was too afraid to say so plainly, even to himself. Whether you choose to stay and help him do that is entirely your own decision, and I will think no less of you whichever way you choose. But you deserved the truth before you made it, and it seems no one else in that house had the courage to give it to you. Margaret thanked her, though the words felt inadequate for what she had just been given, and she walked the rest of the way back to Marlow Street with Eleanor's name turning over and over in her mind, no longer a shadow glimpsed at the edge of every careful silence, but a real woman, gifted and warm, who had chosen blue silk gowns and arranged lavender on a mantel, and filled a house with music before a winter road took everything from her in a single night. When she reached the house, she did not go first to her room. She walked instead to the narrow hallway behind the staircase and stood once more before the green door. And this time, for the first time, she said the name aloud into the quiet of the house. Eleanor, she said softly, I know you now. She did not try the lock. She was not yet ready, and she suspected Nathaniel was even less ready than she was. But she pressed her palm flat against the wood one final time, and felt, for the first time since she had first opened the front door of that house, not a mystery pressing against her from the other side, but something closer to sorrow, patient and enormous, waiting only to be acknowledged rather than avoided. That night she wrote to Nathaniel, not the sharp, demanding letters she had sent before, but a shorter note, gentler in its wording. I know about Edmund, she wrote. I know about Eleanor, and I know it was not your hand on the reins that night, whatever guilt you have carried in his place. I am not angry that you did not tell me yourself. I understand now why the words would not come, but I would like to hear the rest from you, when you are ready, not because I require it to stay, but because I think you have been carrying this alone for far too long, and I do not intend to let you carry it alone any further. She sealed the letter and sent it before she could reconsider a single word of it, and then she sat by the window in the room that had once been prepared. She now understood, for a woman who never lived to see it finished, and she waited to see whether Nathaniel Ashbourne would finally find the courage to answer. The house felt different around her that night, though nothing in it had changed. The same lamp burned low in the hallway, the same fire settled to embers in the parlor grate, the same quiet pressed against the windows from the dark street outside. But Margaret no longer felt as though she were living inside a stranger's secret. She felt instead as though she had finally been led into a room she had been circling for weeks, and though the room held sorrow rather than comfort, there was a kind of relief in simply knowing its shape at last. She thought of Edmund, a man she had never met and never would, driving too fast on an icy road, because the weather had turned, and the light was failing, and perhaps, she thought, because some part of him had simply wanted to get his beloved home before the storm worsened. She thought of the particular cruelty of surviving an accident only to be consumed afterward by the guilt of having survived it, and she found, to her own surprise, that she felt something close to pity for a man whose recklessness she might otherwise have condemned without hesitation. And she thought of Nathaniel, a second son who had never expected the weight of a title, inheriting not only his brother's estates but his brother's guilt alongside them, carrying grief that was not entirely his own, because there was no one else left standing to carry it. It explained so much of what she had seen in him, the careful stillness, the measured words, the way he seemed always to be bracing for some blow that had, in truth, already landed years before she ever met him. Margaret did not know, sitting there in the lamplight with Eleanor's name still fresh on her tongue, whether understanding a man's grief was the same as trusting him, or whether trust would follow understanding the way thread follows a needle, naturally, inevitably, once the first stitch had been set. But she knew she no longer wished to leave. Whatever this house had once been built to hold, she found she wanted, now, to help it hold something new, though she was honest enough with herself to admit she did not yet know what that something would look like, or whether Nathaniel Ashbourne was ready to build it alongside her. She fell asleep eventually, still dressed, still seated by the window, and she did not wake until the gray light of morning crept across the floor and Hannah Doyle knocked gently at her door to tell her a letter had arrived downstairs, sealed with the Ashbourne crest, and that the messenger who delivered it had said His Grace himself would follow within the hour. Nathaniel arrived at Marlow Street exactly within the hour the messenger had promised, and Margaret met him at the door herself rather than waiting for Hannah to announce him, because she had spent the better part of the morning too restless to sit still in any single room. He looked, she thought the moment she saw him, like a man who had not slept, his eyes shadowed, his usual careful composure worn thin at the edges. He held her letter in his hand, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the guarded distance she had grown used to. "You know," he said simply, "about Edmund, about Eleanor. I know what your aunt was willing to tell me," Margaret said, stepping back to let him inside. "I suspect there is more she either did not know or did not think was hers to share. I would like to hear the rest from you, if you are ready to give it." Hannah Doyle appeared briefly at the parlor door with a tray of tea neither of them touched, and the housekeeper's eyes moved between them with a quiet, careful understanding, before she withdrew again and closed the door softly behind her, leaving them alone with the fire and the weight of everything about to be spoken. He followed her into the parlor, and this time, instead of standing at the window with his back half-turned as he so often did, he sat, heavily, in the chair nearest the fire, as though the effort of standing upright while telling this particular truth was more than he could manage. "Edmund was the better son," he began, and there was no bitterness in it, only a plain, worn honesty. Everyone always said so, and it was true. He was warmer than I am, quicker to laugh, easier for people to love without effort. I did not resent him for it. I adored him, the way a younger brother adores an older one who has never once made him feel smaller for being second in line. When he fell in love with Eleanor, I was glad for him, gladder perhaps than I have ever been for anything in my own life. Margaret sat across from him and said nothing, sensing that the words needed room to come at their own pace, rather than being rushed toward some conclusion she might have already guessed. "She used to tease me," he said, and something almost like a smile touched his mouth before fading again. "She said I was too serious for a man not yet 30, that I carried myself like a man twice my age who had already buried all his joy somewhere and forgotten where he left it. She was the only person who ever said such things to me, and made me laugh instead of retreat. I think, if I am honest, some part of me loved her too, quietly, uselessly, the way a man loves something he knows was never meant to be his. I never spoke of it. I would not have dishonored Edmund that way, not for anything, and I do not believe she ever knew. The fire cracked softly in the silence that followed, and Margaret felt something in her chest tighten at the admission, not jealousy exactly, but a kind of ache for the young man he must have been, quietly carrying an affection he had never allowed himself to name. The night of the accident, he continued, his voice growing lower, more careful. They were returning from my aunt's estate, where we had all gathered for a family dinner. The weather turned faster than anyone expected. Edmund insisted on driving them back himself rather than waiting out the storm, because Eleanor had promised her own mother she would return that same evening, and Edmund never could bear to disappoint her in anything, however small. I offered to accompany them. I had my own carriage prepared. He told me to stay, that the roads would be easier with fewer carriages traveling together in the dark, and I listened to him, because I always listened to him, because he was my elder brother, and I trusted every decision he ever made. Margaret watched his hands as he spoke, clasped tightly together between his knees, the knuckles pale. The carriage went off the road 2 miles from the house. A wheel caught ice on a bend Edmund had driven 100 times before without incident. It overturned into the ditch beside it. Eleanor struck her head against the frame of the carriage and never woke again. Edmund survived, physically, though he broke his arm and several ribs, but he was the one who had to sit beside her in that ditch for nearly an hour before help arrived, holding her, watching the life go out of her, unable to do anything to stop it. His voice had gone almost entirely flat now, the careful, controlled tone of a man reciting something so painful that feeling it fully while speaking it aloud would break him. I was the one who found them, he said. I grew concerned when they did not arrive as expected, and I rode out myself despite the storm, and I was the one who pulled my brother from that ditch and understood, before anyone told me, that Eleanor was already gone. I have never in my life felt so useless as I did in that moment, arriving exactly too late to change anything, only in time to witness the aftermath and carry my brother home to a house that would never again hold the woman he loved. Margaret rose from her chair and crossed to kneel beside him, taking his clasped hands in both of hers without a word, and he did not pull away, though she felt a tremor pass through him at the contact. Edmund was never the same afterward, he continued, quieter now. He blamed himself entirely, though I told him again and again that ice on a road in a sudden storm was no one's fault, that he could not have known, that 100 other carriages might have driven that same bend 100 other nights and struck the same patch of ice with the same result. He would not hear it. He stopped eating properly. He stopped sleeping. He locked himself away in his study for days at a time, and when I finally forced my way in one morning because no one had seen him in nearly 2 full days, I found him, and there was nothing left for me to do but bury him beside her and inherit everything he left behind, including a guilt that was never mine to carry, but that I have carried every day since regardless. There was a long silence then, broken only by the settling of the fire, and Margaret let it stretch, sensing that he needed the quiet as much as he needed the words, that grief this old could not be poured out all at once, without some pause to breathe between the worst of it. After Edmund died, he said eventually, I could not bring myself to speak of any of it, not to my aunt, not to the few friends who tried gently to ask, not even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts if I could help it. I threw myself into the duties the title demanded, the estates, the tenants, the endless correspondence that comes with a name like Ashwarn, because busyness was the only thing that kept the silence from closing in on me entirely. I told myself that was strength. I understand now, sitting here with you, that it was only another kind of hiding, no different in its way from locking a door and refusing to walk past it. You blame yourself too, Margaret said softly, not only for failing to save them that night, but for failing to save him afterward. I told him to stay home that evening, he said. I offered to travel with them, and he refused me, and I let him refuse me, because I always deferred to him, because it never once occurred to me that deferring to him that single time would cost him everything. If I had insisted, if I had simply come regardless of what he said, perhaps I would have driven instead, or perhaps a second carriage on the road would have changed the timing entirely, some small variation that might have kept the wheel from ever finding that ice at all. I will never know, and not knowing is its own particular kind of torment. Margaret held his hands more firmly, forcing him, gently, to look at her, rather than at the fire. You were a young man who trusted his brother's judgment. That is not a crime, Nathaniel. That is love, ordinary and human, and it does not deserve the punishment you have built for yourself out of it. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his careful control finally, fully broke, his shoulders dropping, his breath uneven, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. simply held her hands as though they were the only solid thing left in a room that had otherwise gone unsteady beneath him. I locked that door because I could not decide whether keeping her memory sealed away was an act of love or an act of cowardice, he said finally. I still do not know the answer. I only knew that I could not walk past it every day without either question tearing me apart, so I stopped walking past it at all. And then I met you outside that bookshop, and for the first time in 2 years I wanted something that was not grief, and it frightened me more than anything Edmund or Eleanor's deaths ever did, because wanting felt like a betrayal of everything I owed them both. It is not a betrayal to still be alive, Margaret said. It is not a betrayal to want warmth again after so long standing in the cold. Eleanor furnished this house with love, Nathaniel, not so it could sit locked and silent forever, but so it could someday be filled with life again. I do not think she would have wanted it to become a tomb for your happiness as well as hers. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again there were tears he did not bother hiding, an honesty in his grief that Margaret suspected he had allowed almost no one to witness in the 2 years since he buried his brother. I do not know how to open that door, he admitted. I do not know how to walk into that room and see her handwriting and her shawl and not feel every failure of that night all over again. Then we will not open it alone, Margaret said, and we will not open it today. But we will open it, Nathaniel, together, when you are ready. And when that day comes, I will stand beside you the entire time, and you will not have to carry a single moment of it by yourself. There is one more thing, he said quietly, after a while, when some of the rawness in his voice had eased. My aunt likely did not tell you this, because she does not know it herself. In the weeks before the accident, Edmund had begun speaking to me of stepping back from society for a time after the wedding, taking Eleanor abroad, seeing something of the world before the full weight of the title settled permanently over them both. He asked me, half in jest, whether I would mind managing the estates in his absence for a year or two, and I told him I would be glad to, thinking nothing of it beyond an older brother teasing a younger one about responsibility he was not yet eager to claim. I have wondered since whether some part of him already sensed how little time he truly had, though that is likely only grief inventing meaning where none existed. Or perhaps he simply loved her enough to want more of her before the world asked more of him, Margaret said gently. Not every instinct needs a darker explanation, Nathaniel. Sometimes a man in love simply wants time alone with the woman he intends to marry, without a title standing between them. He looked at her for a long moment, something easing further in his expression, as though her plainer, gentler reading of his brother's last weeks had lifted a weight he had not realized he was still carrying. Perhaps, he said, I have spent so long searching every memory for warnings I failed to notice that I forget, sometimes, to simply let a memory be what it was. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and Margaret stayed kneeling beside his chair long after the fire had burned low, holding his hands in the quiet. Understanding at last the full shape of the grief that had built the walls around him, and understanding, too, that she no longer wished to stand outside those walls looking in, but wanted, instead, to help him tear them down, stone by careful stone, until the house on Marlowe Street could finally become what Eleanor had always intended it to be, a home, rather than a monument. The weeks that followed settled into something Margaret had not expected, a quiet, careful rhythm between two people who had stopped guarding every word from each other. Nathaniel called at Marlowe Street most afternoons, and though the green door remained locked, the silence around it had changed character entirely. No longer a wall keeping Margaret out, but a wound the two of them were learning, slowly, to tend together. She returned to her own work as best she could, though the gossip had not entirely faded, and two of her former clients never did resume their arrangements with her. But something in Margaret had shifted since the afternoon Nathaniel sat by the fire and let 2 years of carefully held grief finally spill into the open, and she found she cared less than she once would have about drawing rooms full of women with sharp fans and sharper tongues. She had spent her whole life proving her worth through independence, through never needing anyone, and she began to understand, watching Nathaniel slowly unclench the fists he had kept closed around his own pain for so long, that needing someone was not the same thing as losing herself to them. It was Constance who first said aloud what neither Margaret nor Nathaniel had yet found the courage to name plainly between themselves. She called at Marlowe Street on a gray afternoon in early winter, ostensibly to see how the house was managing under its new resident, though Margaret suspected the true purpose of the visit lay elsewhere entirely. "You are in love with him," Constance said, settling into a chair in the parlor, with the same directness she had shown at the milliner's counter weeks before. "There is no use denying it to me. I have known that boy since he was in short trousers, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Margaret felt heat rise in her face, though she did not deny it outright. "It is complicated," she said instead. "He is still grieving. I am still uncertain whether what stands between us is genuine feeling or simply two lonely people finding comfort in shared sorrow." Constance studied her a long moment. "And which do you believe it to be, in your own honest heart?" Margaret did not answer immediately, turning the question over the way she might turn a length of fabric, checking it from every angle before committing scissors to the cut. "I believe," she said finally, "that grief brought us into the same room, but that what has grown between us since has very little to do with grief at all. I think of him when he is not here, in ways that have nothing to do with Eleanor, or Edmund, or that locked door. I think of the particular way he listens, as though every word I say matters more than anything else in the room. I have never had a man listen to me that way before, Lady Ashbourne, and I do not think I am willing to give it up simply because it began under unusual circumstances." "Then stop calling it complicated," Constance said, not unkindly, "and start calling it what it is." That evening, after Constance had gone, Margaret sat alone in the small writing room upstairs among Eleanor's books, and for the first time she found herself speaking not to the locked door, but to the woman she now understood so much more clearly, the woman whose gown still hung wrapped in linen, whose music had once filled these very walls. "I do not know if it is right," she said quietly into the empty room, "to love a man in the same house you loved, surrounded by everything you chose and never lived to enjoy. I do not know if you would resent me for it, or understand it, or simply not care at all, wherever you are now. But I think, if the stories your household tells are true, that you were not a woman who wanted grief to win. I think you would rather this house held laughter again than silence, and I am trying, in my own uncertain way, to give it that." She did not expect an answer, and none came, only the quiet settling of an old house at night, the creak of timber cooling, the distant sound of a carriage passing on the street below. But something in the silence felt different than it had weeks before, gentler somehow, less like being watched and more like being, quietly, understood. Nathaniel arrived the next morning earlier than usual, and Margaret knew immediately, from the particular set of his shoulders and the careful way he held himself in the parlor doorway, that something had shifted in him as well. "I spoke with my aunt yesterday, after she left you," he said without preamble. "She told me, in her usual manner of saying exactly what she thinks without being asked, that I have spent 2 years mistaking suffering for loyalty, as though the depth of my grief was somehow proof of how much I love them both, and that continuing to suffer serves no one, least of all Edmund and Eleanor, who would surely rather see the people they left behind find some measure of peace, than watch them punish themselves indefinitely for a tragedy neither of them caused." "She is not wrong," Margaret said gently. "I know that now," he said. "I have known it, somewhere beneath the guilt, for longer than I have been willing to admit. But knowing a thing and being able to act on it are not the same, and I have needed you here, walking through this house and asking the questions I was too afraid to ask myself, before I could begin to close the distance between the two." He crossed the room and took her hands, and there was none of the careful hesitation in the gesture that had marked every earlier moment between them. "I am not offering you this house any longer as an apology, or a burden I did not know how to explain," he said. "I am asking you now, plainly, whether you wish to build a life within these walls alongside me, not as a woman living in Eleanor's shadow, but as the woman I have fallen in love with despite every effort I made to guard myself against exactly that." Margaret felt the words settle into her chest with a warmth she had not expected, given how carefully she had trained herself, over years of independence, never to need anything a man might offer her, and yet here it was, offered freely, without condition, and she found she wanted it more than she had wanted anything in a very long time. "I did not come into this house looking for love, Nathaniel," she said. "I came looking for the truth behind a locked door, because I have never in my life been able to leave a mystery unsolved, and because I refused to build a home on top of a secret I did not understand. But somewhere in the finding of that truth, I found you as well, the real you, not the careful, guarded duke who greets society with polished distance, but the man who sat by that fire and wept for a brother he could not save. I love that man, Nathaniel. I want to build something with him, not despite the grief this house holds, but honestly alongside it." He kissed her then, gently, as though she were something he still could not quite believe he was allowed to have, and Margaret felt every careful wall she had built around her own heart over years of hard-won independence finally, willingly, come down. But even as she allowed herself that moment of unguarded happiness, she understood that something still stood between them and any true peace, waiting patiently behind a green door with no handle, and that no declaration of love, however honest, would be complete until that door was finally opened. "We cannot build a life around a room we are both still afraid to enter," she said, when the kiss ended and they stood together by the fire, her hand still resting against his chest. "I do not say that to press you before you are ready. I say it because I think you already know it as well as I do." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the parlor door and, beyond it, the narrow hallway where the locked room waited exactly as it had waited for 2 years. "I know," he said finally. "I have known it since the day I first saw you climb those front steps, demanding an explanation I was not yet brave enough to give. I think, in some strange way, I have been waiting for someone with your particular stubbornness to force the question, because I never trusted myself to ask it alone." "Then let us not wait any longer than we must," Margaret said. "Not today, if today is too soon. But soon, Nathaniel. Choose a day, and I will stand beside you the entire time, exactly as I promised. And whatever grief waits behind that door, we will carry it out of that room together, rather than let it seal us inside a house that could otherwise hold so much more than sorrow." He nodded slowly, and something in his eyes, some final piece of the careful armor he had worn since the night he pulled his brother from that overturned carriage, finally, visibly, began to loosen. "3 days," he said. "Give me 3 days to find the courage properly, and I will send for a locksmith, and we will open it together, exactly as you say. Not because the grief is gone, but because I no longer wish to face it alone, and I do not believe, any longer, that facing it will destroy either of us the way I once feared it would." Margaret pressed her hand more firmly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, and for the first time since she had first read that impossible letter offering her a house she had not asked for, she felt something close to certainty settle over her, not about what waited behind the locked door, but about the man standing in front of her, and the life she had, without ever quite intending it, begun to choose alongside him. The 3 days that followed felt longer to Margaret than the entire month that had come before them. She kept herself busy, finishing the gown she owed her one remaining faithful client, sorting through her own belongings in preparation for a move she now understood was no longer a question of whether, but only of when. But even with her hands occupied, her mind circled constantly back to the narrow hallway behind the staircase, to the door with no handle, to the locksmith Nathaniel had promised to send for. On the first evening, she found herself standing before the door again, later than she meant to still be awake, the house quiet around her, and only a single lamp burning at the far end of the hall. She did not speak to it this time. She simply stood, her palm pressed flat against the cool wood, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what waited on the other side, not as a mystery any longer, but as a woman's whole unfinished life, paused mid-breath 2 years before Margaret had ever climbed the front steps of this house. On the second day, Constance called again, and this time she brought with her a small, carefully wrapped parcel, which she pressed into Margaret's hands without much ceremony. "I do not know if this is my place to give," she said, "but I have carried it longer than I care to admit, and I think it belongs with you now, rather than locked away in my own house doing no one any good." Margaret unwrapped the parcel slowly, and found inside a small portrait, no larger than her palm, painted in delicate detail, showing a young woman with warm brown eyes, and a wide, easy smile, dark curls pinned loosely beneath a straw bonnet, standing in a garden Margaret did not recognize. "This was Eleanor," Constance said quietly, "painted the summer before the accident, at my own request, because I always thought she had the kind of face that deserved to be remembered exactly as she was, laughing, careless, entirely unaware of what waited for her. I kept it separate from the larger portrait that hung in the dining hall, the formal one that was removed after the accident because Nathaniel could not bear to pass it every morning. I thought, perhaps, that this smaller one, kept somewhere gentler than a locked room, might do more good." Margaret held the small portrait carefully, studying the warmth in the painted woman's face, the particular liveliness Constance and Clara, and even old Hannah Doyle had described in fragments over the past weeks, now finally given a face to match the name. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will make certain it is placed somewhere she would have liked, somewhere with light and laughter, rather than shut away again." "See that you do," Constance said, and there was real warmth in her voice beneath the usual brisk directness. "And Margaret, whatever you find behind that door in 2 days' time, remember that grief and love are not opposites. A house can hold both, the way a heart can. Do not let Nathaniel convince himself, in the moment, that choosing you means abandoning them. He will need reminding of that more than once, I suspect, before the lesson finally settles." On the third and final day before the locksmith was due to arrive, Margaret woke early, unable to sleep any longer, and found Nathaniel already waiting for her in the parlor, dressed and composed but with a restlessness in his manner that told her he had likely slept even less than she had. "I have been thinking of what to say to her," he admitted, before Margaret had even taken her seat across from him. "Foolish, perhaps, given that she cannot hear me, but I keep composing sentences in my mind, apologies mostly, though Constance would tell me apologies are not what Eleanor would want from me at all." She would not, Margaret agreed, remembering Constance's words from the day before. She held up the small portrait she had kept close since receiving it, and passed it gently into his hands. "Your aunt gave me this. I thought you should see it before tomorrow, rather than be surprised by it in the moment." Nathaniel took the small painting carefully, and Margaret watched his face as he studied it, watched the complicated mixture of pain and tenderness move across his features, watched him trace the edge of the frame with one careful finger, as though touching it too firmly might somehow disturb the memory it held. "I had forgotten she smiled like this," he said quietly, and his voice caught on the words. "Somewhere in the last 2 years, I let the grief flatten her into something smaller than she was, a name I could not speak, a door I could not open, rather than a woman who laughed in gardens and teased me for being too serious. I think that may be the true cruelty of grief, that it so easily erases the very things that made a person worth grieving in the first place." "Then let tomorrow be the day you remember her properly," Margaret said, sitting beside him and resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "Not as a wound to be sealed away, but as a woman who deserves to be spoken of, and laughed about, and remembered exactly as she was, curls and gardens and all." They sat together like that for a long while as the morning light strengthened outside the parlor windows, and Margaret felt, beneath her own quiet nervousness about what tomorrow would bring, a settled certainty that whatever waited behind that locked door, they would meet it together, and that meeting it, at long last, would not be an ending but the beginning of everything the house on Marlowe Street had always been meant to hold. 3 days, she agreed softly. "And then, whatever we find, we will not be finding it alone." The locksmith arrived at Marlowe Street just after 10 in the morning, an older man named George Whitfield who had clearly been given only the barest instructions, because he set to work on the old lock with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a craftsman focused entirely on the mechanism in front of him, unaware that he stood at the center of something far larger than a simple repair. Margaret stood beside Nathaniel in the narrow hallway, her hand resting lightly against his arm, and she felt the tension running through him with every small click and scrape of the locksmith's tools working at the old mechanism. Hannah Doyle waited a respectful distance away, near the base of the staircase, and even Clara had found some excuse to be nearby, dusting a shelf she had likely already dusted twice that morning, unwilling to miss whatever the day was about to reveal. It took longer than Margaret expected, the lock stubborn with 2 years of disuse, but at last Whitfield straightened, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stepped back from the door with a small, satisfied grunt. "There you are, sir. Sticks a bit, mind, but she'll turn now." Nathaniel thanked him and paid him generously, and Whitfield gathered his tools and let himself out through the servants' entrance, entirely unaware of the significance of what he had just accomplished. And then the hallway fell quiet, only Margaret, Nathaniel, and the door itself, no longer locked, only closed, waiting. "You do not have to do this today," Margaret said softly, though she suspected, from the set of his jaw, that he had already decided otherwise. "I have waited 2 years," he said. "I do not think waiting any longer would make it easier. I think it would only give me more time to invent reasons to keep waiting." He reached out and closed his hand around the small brass fitting where a handle should have been, and Margaret realized, watching him, that the absence of a proper handle had never been an accident of construction but a deliberate choice, made by a man who had wanted the door difficult to open even after it was unlocked, one final barrier against a temptation he had not yet trusted himself to resist. The door swung inward slowly, hinges stiff with disuse, and the room beyond exhaled a breath of stale, cool air, undisturbed for 2 full years. Margaret had imagined this room 100 different ways in the weeks since she first stood before its locked door, but nothing she had pictured matched the quiet, ordinary tenderness of what she actually found. A writing desk sat beneath the window, an unfinished letter still resting upon it, the ink long since dried, the handwriting graceful and looping, cut off mid-sentence as though the writer had simply meant to return to it the following morning. A shawl, pale gray wool, hung across the back of a chair exactly as Nathaniel had described weeks before, as though its owner had only just set it down. A small vase on the side table held the brittle, colorless remains of flowers that had bloomed and died and been forgotten all within these silent, sealed walls. Nathaniel stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, unable to step further, and Margaret did not push him, only stood beside him, her hand still resting on his arm, letting him take in the room at whatever pace he could manage. Somewhere behind them, near the staircase, she heard Hannah Doyle draw a soft, unsteady breath, and understood that the housekeeper had been waiting nearly as long as Nathaniel himself for this door to finally open, carrying her own quiet grief through years of polishing furniture no one was permitted to use. "Take whatever time you need," Margaret said quietly. "There is no one here who will think less of you for standing still a while longer before you step inside." He nodded, though it was several minutes more before he finally crossed the threshold, and when he did, Margaret felt the small tremor that passed through his arm beneath her hand, the effort it cost him simply to place one foot inside a room he had spent 2 years refusing to enter. "She was writing to her sister," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, nodding toward the unfinished letter on the desk. "I remember now. She mentioned it that same afternoon, before we all left for my aunt's estate. She said she would finish it once we returned." Margaret released his arm gently and stepped further into the room herself, moving slowly, respectfully, the way she might move through a church. And she crossed to the writing desk and looked down at the unfinished letter without touching it, reading the graceful, looping hand that Constance had described, the same hand that had signed the books upstairs before someone took a blade to the cover. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, and Margaret felt a strange, unexpected chill move through her at the sight of her own name written there in a stranger's hand. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, and together they read the rest of the unfinished letter, only a few lines, describing nothing more significant than the weather and an upcoming visit and a small joke about Edmund's insistence on choosing curtains he had no true opinion about. But the ordinariness of it struck Margaret more powerfully than any dramatic revelation could have. This was not a tragic figure frozen in grief. This had been a living, breathing woman, writing an unremarkable letter on an unremarkable afternoon, never imagining it would be the last thing her hand ever set to paper. "My sister's name was also Margaret," Nathaniel said quietly, staring at the page. "I had forgotten that entirely until this moment." Margaret felt something settle strangely in her chest at the coincidence, not quite fate, not quite chance, but something that made the whole tangled history of the house feel suddenly, gently, less separate from her own life than she had allowed herself to believe. They moved through the rest of the room together after that, slowly, and Nathaniel told her small things as they went, memories surfacing now that he had finally allowed himself to stand inside them rather than seal them away. The chair by the window was where Eleanor liked to sit in the mornings, watching the street below and inventing stories about the passers-by to make Edmund laugh over breakfast. The small collection of pressed flowers in a shallow dish near the vase had been gathered on a country walk the spring before her death, each one labeled in her own hand with the place it had been found. A single glove, its match long since lost or never found, sat forgotten on the windowsill, and Nathaniel picked it up and held it a long moment before setting it gently back down. "I thought opening this door would feel like losing her all over again," he said finally, standing in the middle of the room with the pale afternoon light falling across the desk and the chair and the small, ordinary remnants of a life cut short. "But it does not feel like losing her. It feels like finally being allowed to remember her properly, the way Constance always said I should have from the beginning." Margaret took his hand. "What will you do with the room now?" He considered the question a long moment, looking around at everything the space still held. "I do not think I want to seal it away again," he said slowly. "But I do not think I want it to remain exactly as it is either, a shrine no one is permitted to disturb. Perhaps we clear it gently, keep what matters most, the letter, the portrait your aunt gave you, a few small things, and let the rest of the room breathe again, become something useful, something alive, rather than a room forever waiting for a woman who is never coming back through that door." "That sounds like exactly what she would have wanted," Margaret said. "A house that keeps her memory without keeping her prisoner in it." They spent the better part of that afternoon in the room together, and by evening, they had gathered the few items that mattered most, the unfinished letter, the pressed flowers, the small painted portrait, the pale gray shawl, setting them carefully aside to be kept somewhere gentler than a locked room with no handle, somewhere Nathaniel could visit them freely, rather than being sealed away from them entirely. The rest of the room, the desk, the chair, the vase, would remain, but the door itself, Nathaniel decided, would never again be locked, its old stubborn mechanism removed entirely, and replaced with a simple, ordinary handle, the same as every other door in the house. 3 days later, once the room had been aired and gently rearranged, Nathaniel held a small private gathering at Marlowe Street, nothing grand, only Constance, Hannah Doyle, and a handful of the household staff who had served the house through every year of its silence, and he stood before them in the parlor and spoke plainly, without the careful distance he had once used to guard every word. "Many of you know this house held a room I could not bring myself to open," he said. "I want you to know that room is open now, and will remain open, and that the woman who once filled this house with music and laughter will be remembered properly from this day forward, not as a secret we tiptoed around, but as someone we are permitted, finally, to speak of freely. I also want you to know that this house will soon have a mistress in truth, not merely in name, and that I could not have found the courage to open that door without her patience, her stubbornness, and her refusal to accept silence in place of honesty." Margaret felt her face warm under the sudden attention of the room, but she did not look away, and when Nathaniel reached for her hand in front of the assembled household, she gave it willingly, without hesitation, understanding that whatever gossip had once circulated through Mayfair drawing rooms mattered a great deal less than the truth standing plainly in front of her now. That evening, once the small gathering had dispersed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Margaret walked once more to the room that had been locked for so long, its door now standing open, a simple brass handle where the old stubborn lock had been. She stepped inside and crossed to the window, where the small portrait of Eleanor now sat propped on the sill, catching the last of the evening light. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "I did not let you become a ghost who used to keep the rest of us at a distance. I hope, wherever you are, that you do not mind sharing this house with someone new. I promise to fill it with laughter, exactly the way you once did, and I will make certain he never forgets the woman who taught him, in whatever small way she could, how to love without fear." Behind her, in the doorway, Nathaniel watched her a long moment before crossing the room to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist, and together they looked out at the darkening street below, the house around them no longer holding its breath, no longer paused mid-moment waiting for a life that would never return, but settling instead, gently and finally, into the beginning of a new one. In the weeks that followed, the house on Marlow Street began, slowly and unmistakably, to change. Margaret had the dining room's empty portrait frame filled again, not with the formal painting that had once hung there, which Nathaniel decided should remain with Constance, kept safe and visited freely rather than displayed daily where old grief might catch him unaware, but with a small watercolor Margaret commissioned of the garden behind the house, bright and unpretentious, the first new addition the room had seen in 2 years. The lavender on the mantel was replaced regularly now, fresh each week, and Margaret found she rather liked the small ritual of choosing it herself, snipping fresh stems and arranging them exactly as she pleased, rather than leaving a bowl of dried flowers to gather dust as a monument to absence. The wardrobe upstairs, once filled entirely with Eleanor's carefully wrapped gowns, was gently sorted as well, some pieces kept and given to Eleanor's sister in the north, whom Margaret wrote to directly, a careful, gentle letter explaining who she was, and what she hoped to build in the house her sister had once furnished with such evident love. The reply, when it came weeks later, was shorter than Margaret expected, but warmer than she had dared to hope, thanking her plainly for the kindness of asking, rather than simply disposing of what remained, and wishing her, in careful, old-fashioned phrasing, every happiness the house had once been meant to hold. Clara, no longer required to invent excuses to avoid the narrow hallway, took to humming while she dusted the now open room, and one afternoon, Margaret found her standing before the window where Eleanor's chair still sat, gently rearranging the pressed flowers in their shallow dish with obvious careful affection, as though she too had come to feel some quiet connection to the woman whose life had shaped the house long before either of them arrived within it. Society, predictably, found a great deal to say once word of the engagement spread, though the character of the gossip shifted considerably from its earlier, sharper edge. The same women who had once whispered behind their fans now spoke instead of romance and second chances, of a duke finally emerging from 2 years of quiet mourning, and Margaret found she cared even less about their opinions now than she had during the difficult weeks before, secure enough in what she had built that outside judgment simply slid past her without finding purchase. Several of her former clients, sensing the shift in public sentiment, wrote asking to resume their arrangements with her, and Margaret, with a satisfaction she did not bother hiding, declined every one of them, choosing instead to keep only the handful of women who had remained loyal through the difficult months when loyalty cost something. Nathaniel proposed properly on a cold, clear evening in the garden behind the house, the same garden Margaret had commissioned for the new watercolor in the dining room, and he did so without any of the careful, guarded distance that had once defined nearly every conversation between them. He spoke instead with the plain, unguarded honesty she had first glimpsed the day he sat by the parlor fire, and told her the whole truth of Edmund and Eleanor, And when he asked her to marry him, kneeling in the frost-touched grass with the small portrait of Eleanor watching, in a sense, from the lit window above them, Margaret said yes without a single moment of hesitation, though she made certain, laughing, to tell him afterward that she fully expected him never to keep secrets locked behind doors from her again. Not for 2 years, not for 2 days. "I promise," he told her, and she believed him completely, because the man who made that promise was no longer the same careful, guarded duke who had once handed her a letter and a key without explanation, but a man who had finally learned that love, honestly given, required no locks at all. Margaret Ashby moved into the house on Marlow Street the following week, not as a woman living inside another woman's shadow, but as its true mistress at last, choosing every day afterward to fill its rooms with exactly the kind of warmth Eleanor had always intended them to hold, and never once regretting the stubborn refusal that had first demanded the whole truth before she would ever agree to call it home. Spring came early to Marlow Street that year, and with it came the wedding Margaret had once believed, during those first uncertain weeks in a house full of locked silence, she would never allow herself to want. It was a small ceremony, deliberately so, held in the garden behind the house rather than in some grand cathedral full of curious strangers, because both Margaret and Nathaniel had agreed, without much discussion, that they wanted the day to belong to the people who had actually stood beside them through the difficult months, rather than to society's endless appetite for spectacle. Constance sat in the front row of the small gathering, dressed in deep violet as always, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a handkerchief she pretended not to need. Hannah Doyle stood near the back with the rest of the household staff, Clara beside her, both women smiling openly for the first time Margaret could remember since her earliest days in that house. Even old Whitfield the locksmith had been invited, at Nathaniel's particular insistence, given that his ordinary afternoon's work had, in its own small way, changed the course of an entire household. Margaret wore a gown of pale gold silk, one she had made herself, insisting, despite Nathaniel's gentle protests, that she was more than capable of stitching her own wedding dress, and that she intended to walk toward him wearing something built by her own 2 hands rather than purchased and delivered by someone else's. The result, everyone agreed, was more beautiful than anything a shop could have produced, simple and elegant, the fine, careful stitching along the bodice a quiet testament to years of skill she had built entirely on her own, before a duke's letter ever changed the shape of her life. The small portrait of Eleanor sat, that day, on a table near the garden entrance, alongside the pressed flowers and the unfinished letter, framed now rather than tucked away, a deliberate choice both Margaret and Nathaniel had made together in the weeks leading up to the wedding. It felt right, Margaret had said, to let her be present in whatever quiet way was possible, rather than pretending the house's history began only the day Margaret herself arrived. Nathaniel had agreed without hesitation, and more than one guest paused before the small table that afternoon, remembering aloud, gently and without sorrow, the warmth Eleanor had once brought into every room she entered. The ceremony itself was brief, and Margaret found she barely remembered the words spoken over them afterward, only the steadiness of Nathaniel's hands as he took hers, and the particular way his composure, so carefully guarded during their earliest meetings, had softened entirely into something open and unguarded, visible to anyone watching. When at last they were pronounced husband and wife, the small gathering broke into warm, unrestrained applause, and Margaret laughed, genuinely and freely, in a way she could not remember doing in the whole difficult year that had led them to this garden. The house itself seemed different in the months that followed, though Margaret sometimes struggled to explain exactly how, beyond simply saying that it finally felt lived in rather than merely occupied. The music room, long silent, heard sound again, though Margaret herself had never learned the pianoforte properly, and it was Nathaniel, to her surprise, who sat down one evening and picked out a simple, halting tune he admitted he had not played since he was a boy, before duty and grief had crowded every lighter pursuit out of his days. Margaret sat beside him and listened, and though the melody was imperfect, she thought it was the finest sound the house had heard in years. Constance visited often, never quite losing her habit of arriving with direct opinions and sharper observations than most people cared to hear, but Margaret had come to treasure those visits deeply, understanding that beneath the brisk manner sat a woman who had quietly kept watch over this entire fractured family long before Margaret ever arrived to help mend it. It was Constance, in fact, who first suggested that the small writing room upstairs, once filled only with Eleanor's books and their carefully cut-away name, might make a fine place for Margaret's own work, and Margaret took to the suggestion immediately, moving her sewing basket and her bolts of fabric into the quiet, light-filled space, filling the shelves gradually with her own books alongside Eleanor's, rather than replacing one woman's presence with another's. By early summer, word had reached Margaret that several of the drawing rooms that had once shunned her now spoke instead of her skill with a needle, requesting her particular attention for gowns meant for the coming season's grandest events, and Margaret accepted only the commissions that genuinely interested her, no longer needing the income the way she once had, but unwilling entirely to give up the craft that had built her independence in the first place. She kept a small workroom at Marlow Street, exactly for this purpose, and more than one client left commenting, with evident surprise, that the Duchess of Ashbourne stitched hems every bit as fine as any professional seamstress in London, never quite realizing they had simply spoken to the very woman whose reputation they had once been so eager to dismiss. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself changed in quieter, less visible ways. He no longer flinched at the mention of his brother's name in casual conversation, and had taken, in fact, to speaking of Edmund often and warmly, telling Margaret stories over supper of a childhood spent trailing after an older brother who never once made him feel unwelcome in his shadow. He visited the formal portrait kept at Constance's house regularly now, no longer avoiding it, and had commissioned, quietly, a small memorial stone to be placed in the garden at his aunt's estate, near the spot Edmund and Eleanor had once walked together. A simple marker bearing both their names and the single word, chosen carefully after long consideration, remembered. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after Margaret had first read that impossible letter offering her a house she had never asked for, she found herself once again in the small room upstairs, sorting fabric for a new commission, when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, watching her with the particular quiet fondness that had become so familiar to her over the months since their wedding. "You look entirely at home," he said. Margaret glanced up from her work and smiled. "I did not always believe I would say this, but I think I finally am." He crossed the room and sat beside her, glancing at the shelf of books where Eleanor's remaining volumes sat alongside Margaret's own, the damaged cover with its carefully cut-away name still visible among them, kept deliberately rather than replaced, a small, honest reminder of everything the house had survived to become what it now was. "I used to think love and grief could not occupy the same space," he said quietly, "that choosing one meant abandoning the other entirely. You taught me otherwise, though I do not think either of us realized that was the lesson when you first stood in my study demanding an explanation I was too frightened to give." Margaret set down her sewing and took his hand. "Grief built this house," she said, "but I think, in the end, love is what finally opened it, and love is what will keep its doors from ever needing to be locked again." Autumn brought with it a letter from Eleanor's sister in the north, longer this time than her first careful reply, and warmer still, mentioning at last a wish to visit Marlow Street in the coming spring, something she admitted she had not felt able to consider in all the years since the accident. Margaret wrote back immediately, inviting her plainly and without hesitation, and when she showed the exchange to Nathaniel that evening, she watched something in his face ease further still, another small piece of the old grief finally settling into something gentler than guilt. "We should have the room ready for her," he said, "not changed beyond recognition, but welcoming. I think she would want to see that her sister's things were kept with care, not simply cleared away." Margaret agreed, and together they spent several evenings that autumn deciding exactly how the room should look when Eleanor's sister finally arrived, keeping the writing desk and the chair by the window exactly as they had always been, but adding fresh curtains in a soft cream that let more light spill across the floor than the old, heavier drapes ever had. It was, Margaret thought, watching Nathaniel hold up two different shades of fabric and ask her opinion with genuine, unguarded interest, the clearest sign yet of how far he had traveled from the careful, guarded man who had once refused to speak Eleanor's name at all. The household, too, had settled into an ease none of them could have imagined during those first tense weeks of Margaret's arrival. Clara had grown bold enough to ask Margaret, shyly, whether she might learn a little of the needle herself, and Margaret took to teaching her on quiet afternoons, delighted to find the girl had a natural, careful eye for fine stitching that reminded Margaret sharply of her own younger self, learning the same skills over her mother's shoulder years before. Hannah Doyle, too, seemed lighter somehow, no longer carrying herself with the careful blankness she had worn like armor during Margaret's first days in the house, quicker now to smile, quicker to speak plainly, rather than guardedly whenever Margaret asked her opinion on some small matter of the household. Even the neighbors on Marlow Street, who had once watched the tall townhouse with its shuttered windows and its silent staff with a certain wary curiosity, grew accustomed over the months to warmer signs of life, lamplight spilling more freely from its windows in the evenings, occasional music drifting faintly from the pianoforte, the sound of laughter carrying sometimes from the garden on fine afternoons. It became, gradually and without any single dramatic moment marking the change, simply a home among other homes, rather than the quiet, watchful curiosity it had once been. Margaret thought often, in those settled, contented months, of the frightened, furious woman who had once stood in a Grosvenor Square receiving room and refused to accept a gift she did not understand, and she found she felt no regret at all for that stubbornness, understanding now that it had been exactly the thing the house, and the man who owned it, had needed most. Had she simply accepted the townhouse quietly, grateful and unquestioning, she suspected Nathaniel might have remained locked behind his own careful walls indefinitely, offering comfort from a careful distance rather than ever being forced to confront the grief he had spent 2 years avoiding. It had taken her refusal, her insistence on the whole truth rather than a comfortable half-explanation, to finally crack open a door that guilt alone had never been able to unlock. On the anniversary of the day she had first received that impossible letter, Margaret found the original still tucked away in a small drawer of her writing desk, the paper softened now with handling, and she sat for a while that evening rereading it, remembering the trembling uncertainty with which she had first held it, convinced it could only mean trouble. She smiled now at the memory of her own suspicion, though she did not regret a moment of it, understanding that the caution which had once felt like pride was, in truth, exactly what had carried her safely and honestly into the life she now held. Outside the window, the garden Eleanor had once walked through in warmer months bloomed fully into summer, and somewhere below, faintly, Margaret could hear Hannah Doyle humming as she moved through the halls, and Clara's quiet laughter drifting up from the kitchen, and the ordinary, unremarkable sounds of a house that had finally, after so many years of careful silence, learned how to simply live.